Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Wisdom Words podcast, where every week we are in conversation with people who have stories, advice, and life hacks, all of which bring you one step closer to that feeling of hope. I'm your host, Neil Trivedi, and today we are joined back by one of our favorite guests. That's why we keep bringing her back. We love having her on. Shoshana Marcus, and more popularly known as Show on all the social media platforms and little trivia, Sarah at Starbucks. I'm kidding. Yeah. But no, how are you doing today, Show?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on again.
It's always a pleasure. And today, of course, we're talking about what a parent wound. Ooh, I cannot talk today. For those are wondering, I'm suffering with a little bit of a cold, so I'm just getting over that. So if I stumble my words or if I'm unclear, that's the reason why. But yeah, we're going to be talking about the parent wound and possibly break it down. So I guess we could start with explaining to our audience, what is the parent wound?
Yeah, so the parent wound, it's just that concept, that idea that as we're kids, as we are growing up in the homes of our family, out of our parents, when our parents say things, when they overly criticize us, when they degrade us, when they're not proud of our accomplishments, when they don't create a safe space, all of those different kinds of elements, what we tend to do, especially as kids, and it's actually, as kids, it's a protective measure, right? As adults, it stays with us, but it's not as much protective as it is harmful. And what we do is we internalize because it's easier and it's safer. So it's safer to say, I'm at fault, than my parents who are supposed to protect me, my parents who are supposed to keep me safe, are at fault here, because that's scarier as a child to acknowledge. And so we tend to internalize things, and what happens there is then we tend to continue to believe this. Now, this is our truth. So when we, let's say, we're a kid and we're playing soccer and we made 3 goals in one game, and that's awesome. And we're so proud of ourselves, and we tell our mom or our dad or whoever and say, hey, like, look what I did. And they're like, oh, okay. And they're like on their phone or whatever. And they kind of disregard it completely. We begin to feel like, oh, so this isn't a big accomplishment. This doesn't matter. My accomplishments don't have value. They don't, it doesn't matter if I'm doing good or not. And so then as we grow up into our childhood and our teenhood and our adulthood, we begin to have that same belief. So when we get a new job, or when we graduate from high school, from college, when we are the first member of our family to go to postgraduate school, we begin to not really feel that excitement, or feel that maybe not excitement, but also accomplishment. And we tend to have trouble being in touch with our feelings, or having trouble to be happy, or having trouble to be proud of ourselves. So that's just one, example of the many examples of the parent wound that can impact us. Another one is like enmeshed parenthood, when the parent is emotional and they expect us to take care of their needs, that we are responsible for how they feel. And then as an adult, become people pleasers, and then that's our safety. So yes, as a kid, that is protective, because if our parent is, especially one that gets very, like, I don't know how to say it in like layman's terms. If our parent is very unpredictable, then it's our job to make sure that they are as stable and as comfortable and as safe as possible. And when we grow up, we do the same thing with other people, because we kind of conceptualize that. There's this idea that when our parents are parenting us, we take that relationship and we kind of apply it to basically everyone else we meet in life. And obviously we don't do it consciously, but that's when kind of attachment styles come into play, where parents are, let's say they don't get our needs met. And then we grow up and we become very self-independent, self-sufficient. We don't ask other people for help. If we need help, we'll figure it out how to do it ourselves. And that's kind of part of that idea. And a lot of people who have this tendency, it's because they don't trust that other people will be there for them. And that really ties back to, parents. And I guess the last thing on this specific topic I want to share is that we call it the parent wound, because that's kind of the typical I guess, household setup for most people. But I think it's important to know that not all people grow up with parents. So some people grow up with their grandmothers and their grandfathers. Some people grow up in foster care. Some people grow up with mainly babysitters. So it doesn't just have to be the specifically parents. So we could even call it the caretaker wound, but just for society purpose and how we like to generalize everything. The term is parent. Yeah.
Now we hear that, and I've done episodes on this as well, where generational trauma can even start in the womb and stuff like that. What are the earliest ages that the parent wound can start influencing the child? And is it really like when they're, say, could it be something as simple as if they're crying and they're not being taken care of when they're crying, then can it start then, or how does that work?
So yes, if you're in the womb and you're crying, I think that's fine, because we can't hear that anyway.
Of course.
Yeah, so no part there. I do think that generational trauma, it goes back to attachment theory, because most things with parents and kids do. Generational trauma, it's this idea that the parent is unhealed, and they don't do it on purpose most of the time, but they will take out kind of their own stuff on their children. So maybe, as when the parent was younger, they were neglected and they weren't taken care of. So then as they have this new child in their home, a new addition to the family, they may do that same thing. They may not get the kids' needs met as much. They may become more annoyed with the kids crying, things like that. So generational trauma, it has to do more, I think at least, with this attachment style of, so there's several different attachment styles. There's disorganized attachment, there's anxious attachment, there's secure, which is like 10% of the population. No, hopefully more, but it's very and then what did I say? Ambivalent, anxious, and there is one more, and I should know this, but I don't. So there's 4 attachment styles. And I'm probably going to remember it when I'm like, when I'm done with the podcast, I'm like in the bathroom. But yeah, and so ambivalent or disorganized is kind of that idea of like being very present and being very, very there for the kid and being like, hey, like, let's go out for ice cream, and being really like, supportive, and being that parent who does come to that soccer game and is super excited that you make that goal. And then they flip, and then they're not present and they're emotionally attached, and you say something, hey, guess what, I got an A on my test, and they're like, okay, cool, whatever, like, go over there, like, I don't want to hear it, and that's where that trust comes into play. Anxious attachment is when those kids, they grow up to always want that reassurance, and that reassurance that they're cared about, that they're loved, and that kind of stuff. Secure is when you are obviously secure and you trust your partner, you trust your friendships, and you have a healthy idea of what is safe and what's not safe, and all those kinds of things. So there's another thing actually that I hadn't kind of put to 2 until I talked to a colleague the other day, but in the mental health setting, there's something we call vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma, it's basically like secondhand trauma, but a little bit different. So as a therapist, as a clinician, I may be sitting there, and for full disclosure for anyone who's listening right now, I'm not actually in practice right now, but I will be in like a couple months. But I do have clients, and I do see clients and talk about mental health stuff, and I have my independent clients as well within have a supervisor above me. So if I'm sitting there, right, and I have a client and they're telling me, at this gas station, this really traumatic thing happened to me. And so I may listen to that and I may take it in and have empathy and all that good stuff. Then they leave my office, and then I'm driving home and I see that gas station and my heart starts beating and I start being really paranoid or anxious or any of those things. So that's a concept of vicarious trauma, and you actually can get actual PTSD symptoms from it. So hypervigilance, anxiety, your worldview changes. So you may feel like, if you have a faith, a religion, a spirituality, you may kind of lose faith in that. You may think that everyone's out to get you, those kinds of things. So that's what vicarious trauma is. And usually it's put in the setting of mental health providers, or paramedics, or even policemen, or, those kinds of first responder situations. However, it also is applied in parenthood. So when the parent says, oh, don't pick up the phone because X, Y, and Z is going to call. I actually had a colleague a couple months ago where she was talking about how her mother was a therapist, and her mother basically worked with a lot of like people in prison, basically. And so I don't know why they would call her home phone, but they would. So
Wow.
basically, for whatever reason, I don't know if she was being stalked, or I don't know if maybe it wasn't her home phone and it was like her work phone, but she just left it in the house. I don't know, kind of the situation. But
Right.
basically, she would tell her child, like, don't answer the phone because these people are X, Y, and Z. And so that kid grew up to kind of have that fear of like, whenever the phone rings, having like anxiety, like, oh my gosh, like, who is it? I don't want to pick it up, and kind of viewing it as a threat. So obviously, a very specific example, but that is one example of how when you are with a kid and you kind of put these ideas in their head, if it's an idea that is kind of a scary one for the child, that can have them carry it, through adulthood or through, however long, and kind of have that fear instilled in them by someone else. What I will say though is I think that there is health in that in some ways. So don't let your kid go on the internet and text and talk to whoever,
Yeah.
you have
Yeah.
some boundaries and some limits. I think it's the
Of
way you
course.
kind of share that. And I guess in this whole podcast, I want to share that my purpose is not to blame any parents, because I know, being a parent in general, there is a lot of hesitancy of imposter syndrome of, am I doing a good job? And when their kid becomes a teenager and starts slamming doors, oh, what did I do? And generally, it's not anything that you did. Hormones are flying everywhere. They're trying to navigate independence while also living in the home that you're living in. They're trying to navigate, a lot of different things. Are confused. So I guess I just want to say that, like, in this podcast, I will talk a lot about how parents, how they impact kids in not great ways, but it's not meant to, shame any parent for parenting.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I guess the other question you asked here was about kids crying. So there's actually in orphanages and similar places like that, but mainly orphanages. You go in there and no kids are crying. There could be 100 kids in there. No one's crying. And it's this phenomenon of learned helplessness, because these kids are in these places and they are crying because that's the only way they know how to get their needs met, and they're not getting their needs met. So they learn that crying is not helpful. I don't know what else to do because I can't walk. I can't really talk. I can only cry. That's all I can do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to sit here in my dirty diaper. I'm going to sit here being hungry. I'm going to sit here, wanting attention, and I'm just going to sit here. And it's actually a really sad phenomenon. And a lot of parents actually who do adopt children, they bring the kid home. They're like, oh my gosh, like my baby is so good. She hardly ever cries. And they say it as if it's something to be proud of. And while it can make definitely for a more peaceful home environment, it also is not good for the kid, and it's not healthy for the child in most cases. And again, there are kids that just cry less. So I'm not saying like if your kid doesn't cry, it's because of this. Yeah, so I think that, but there is a healthy balance, right? Because we learn in, it's called cognitive behavior therapy. And basically, if every single time your kid cries, you go to them for attention or for whatever they need, especially if they're a little bit older and they are able to, voice their needs, then you're actually enabling them. And then they're going to continue that behavior because that behavior is getting their needs met. And you are enforcing that behavior. So that's something that is kind of that tree line, because I know that it's kind of like split in society. And some people are like, I let my baby cry and then they'll stop. And then some people are, and then some people are the opposite, where they're like, let me get to my kid on every single need, and every single time my child like makes a noise, I need to go and comfort the child. And I think that both can be true, but it depends on developmental milestones. So if your kid is like a week old, then please attend to their needs. If your kid is like 5 years old and is crying every 2 minutes, and can and doesn't have a cognitive disability or anything, and can very easily say, hey, I'm hungry, I need food, or do it in other ways that are a little bit more productive, and every time they start having a tantrum, basically you give that attention, then that's when it becomes, maybe you should not do that.
Yeah,
so
makes sense.
yeah, so that's kind of that there. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. So basically it could start, soon as the kid comes into the world, if the parents are not treating that properly or ignoring it. There could be so many things, right, that could go to their earliest ages if one is not careful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even in the womb at the same time, like obviously again, like I said, like if the fetus is crying, then whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
however, however, if you treat your child in the womb poorly, and if you like talk to them negatively, basically, that does impact them. And maybe not to the same degree. It's not like if you tell your baby and the fetus like they're going to be a failure, they're not going to grow up as an adult and be like, oh my gosh, like I'm a failure, basically solely on that. However, there's a lot of kids actually who are treated, especially adopted kids, who are treated like with a lot of love in the womb, and they grow up to become more resilient people. Obviously, there are other factors to that. However, generally, that's kind of what happens, and a lot of them don't really understand, why until they do eventually meet their birth parents. But a lot of times, like that's a thing as well. And so you are more vulnerable, even as a fetus, if you are treated, poorly. Whether this is not self-talk, but talk or other things, and it can, kind of hurt your psyche, even if you're not really fully conscious of it. Again, depending on the age, fetuses, they can hear things within the womb, and this is completely separate. But I just learned recently that babies, when they're actually born, some babies, they actually go to bed to vacuum cleaners because it mimics the sounds of the womb.
Really?
Super interesting, because I definitely would not go to sleep with my vacuum cleaner.
Me neither.
But it's interesting because it does mimic the kind of sounds of the womb, and that's also why white noise is so helpful for babies, because it is a lot quieter, but it does mimic that vacuum noise. It's partly for the baby, but I think it's also partly for the mother as well. Being pregnant is, for most people, not a pleasant experience, and even especially people who have peripartum depression. There's a lot of women actually who kind of feel like, I'm not excited for this, I don't want this, or they see their body changing, or they are almost scared or dreading it, or thinking like, what am I doing bringing a kid into this world? And there's a lot of that going on. Or postpartum is when postpartum depression is when they have those same feelings and they can't really attach to their child. So they think, what's wrong with me? What did I do? And even in some serious cases of postpartum depression, there are symptoms of psychosis even. So it's a broad spectrum, and I think in general, the music for the baby can be, paramountly helpful. And I also think that if the mother is happy, the baby is more likely to feel safe in there as well.
So I'm assuming the parent wound can be applicable even when parents are not overtly abusive, or rather don't mean to be abusive, versus that side where they say, well, I was abused by my parents or this or that, or left home when I was 14, or so on and so forth, those kind of stories. So I'm assuming it can be either knowingly, if they're just bad people, if your parents are just bad people, or unknowingly, even if, let's say, they don't mean to be like mean parents or abusive parents, but they just might be doing it because, like you said earlier, maybe because of their own wounds, their own history, or that's all they know, or various other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's a cultural thing as well for some places, because especially for people who are, first generational immigrants, or second generational, I guess, or both, and they come to America and all their friends' parents are treating them a certain way, but let's say they're Asian and they have a lot higher expectations than their friends do, and then there's that disconnect. Or let's say their parents are from Africa, and so the idea of mental health is very different. The idea of openness to the LGBTQ community is very different than their peers. And so those are just, some examples. And the thing is that there's definitely some parents that are like, well, I got looked at as a kid, so you can too. That idea. But then also parents who genuinely believe that they're doing the best for their child. And that's where the bulk, I think, of parents will come in with for family therapy with their kids, because those are the parents that know there's something wrong. And it's funny because a lot of times they know something's wrong with their child, but don't know that they have any impact at all. So they'll say, hey, fix my kid. I'm like, that's not how it works. But generally those are more the parents that are, even if they're not in the beginning, they will eventually become willing to work on that. And those are the parents that don't mean to do any harm. Very rarely will you see a parent come in with their child when they are abusing the kid. That doesn't really happen. Generally, if those situations do happen, they're not the ones seeking help because they already know. And especially if it is like overt abuse, or if they again know they're doing wrong. But I think honestly, most of the parent wounds, the majority of them, are not purposeful. Most of them, they don't know, they don't understand. Because a lot of times, especially, it is generational in that actual generations versus like age-wise, because just now are we kind of beginning to get into a phase of being more open and being more treating kids as people, treating kids as having their own opinions and their own values, and teaching kids consent. Because I remember even when I was growing up, if someone came over to me and wanted a hug, I had to hug them. I didn't have a choice. Whereas now we're teaching our kids that if you don't want to hug someone, that is okay. You don't owe that to them. And know that when people touch your body, that is your body and that is your space. So you can say no. And we're teaching kids feelings. We're teaching kids emotions now. And we're teaching kids how to emotionally regulate better than definitely when I was taught how to, or how not to emotionally regulate. We're having more, and I don't know if it's just my social media, but I know that when I'm on social media, I see a ton more mental health posts than I did when I was a kid.
For
and
sure.
there's a lot less stigma, both with mental health, but also with, sexual identity, in the LGBTQ community. There's more awareness into ethnicity and race and racism, and, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then there's the Me Too movement, and all these different, concepts are coming out. So I think, back in the day, that's not something that was a thing, that you didn't really talk about it or know about it. And so, and I think it is harder. I mean, I could imagine it would be hard for people to grow up in a certain idea that to be a man, you got to be tough. And now as we are moving away from that, but for that person, that's what they learned. That's how they grew up. That's what they've known for the last, 30, 40 years. And so, yes, there are new concepts coming out, but it's not kind of easy to switch like that for most people. And I think in general, just people are just so different. And how someone processes something is going to be so different than someone else. And that's the good and the bad thing, about people. And so that's why, someone says, I've had so many people come to me and they're like, so this person presents this way. What do they have? I don't know. I'm going to lead a lot more than that. So that's the other thing. Like, you can have two people either in the same situation, and not having their needs met, and one person could come out very independent and like, I don't want to trust anyone because I know that I can't trust anyone. And then we have another person coming out who also didn't get their needs met, that feels so deprived of not getting their needs met and needs someone and needs some almost dependency. And then we also have some people coming out who had that, who have these parts of them, and one part of them says, no, I can't trust anyone. Let me just be myself. Let me just do my own thing. And then we have that other part of them that's like, no, but I crave that so much. I really want that connection. I want to feel loved. I want to feel cared about. I want someone to care about me. And then they switch back and forth. And so it's really hard for them to accept support and accept emotional, support, but also use their own coping skills, because they have their own coping skills because they've done this alone for so long. But being able to both have the same at one time is very hard for them. It's like that black and white thinking. And so and unfortunately with those people, it is really hard to maintain any type of relationship, especially a close one, because they go back and forth between those. And unfortunately how it is, it can get exhausting when you are someone who is trying to help this friend or whoever this person is, and whenever they're around you, they're always emotionally unstable, and they're always, crying and screaming and all these things and doing other types of behaviors. And it's hard because being around that all the time is it's hard. It's
Yeah,
tiring. And
because it
so,
starts draining us, the people around them too. It can start if it's like constantly, if that's all they're doing when they're around you, then it can start draining our energy too, right?
yeah, exactly. And then most people, especially people who are a little bit more aware on boundaries and, our sense of self and our sense of safety, will eventually say like, hey, like this can't happen anymore. And it sucks for that person because they're in this pattern. And the whole reason they're doing this is because they want to feel cared about. They want to feel connected. They want to feel safe. They want to feel like they are unconditionally loved or unconditionally cared for. But by doing that, they're like manifesting the opposite.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it is really, it's, a tough thing. And what I always say is that that sucks for that person. They will
yeah.
find their way, but it's not your responsibility to stick with them while you're draining your own sense of safety or sense of uh, preserving your own energy.
Yeah, yeah. That was going to be like my next question is like, how do you deal with that? And is it just setting that boundary and saying, okay, look, I'll be there for them, but I can't like, they can't fix or they can't be expected to like fix the problem for them, or like how does a friend go about doing that? Where setting that boundary where when it's needed, but at the same time, giving some kind of signal that okay, it's not like we're cutting them off because we hate them. It's more because we feel okay, it's best for them to figure out before they come back. Or I'm probably doing a terrible job of phrasing that question, but I think you get the gist of it, right?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I think there's definitely different ways to go about this, and depending on the age and depending on the specific person and what they're going through. And I think what's really important, especially for most people who are going through this, is that the receiving person of the boundary, there generally are going to be people that are very in tune to how you're behaving. So I always say communication first, because
Yeah,
what a lot of people do is they say, I don't want to set the boundary. I just want to kind of like let it float away. Let me not set a clear boundary, but let me just, when they ask for support, let me just give out a resource. Let me just give out a crisis resource, or, let me do more problem solving versus listening. And obviously, yes, listening, but not listening for like 3 hours at a time. But let me do more problem solving here. And
yeah,
those can all be really good things. And that person can also take that as, why are they distancing? What's changing? Did I do something wrong? So that's why I think communication is so, so important, especially with these people, but really for anyone. And I think that
yeah,
the thing about boundaries is, I don't know why this is a thing. I don't know where it came from, but boundaries for a lot of people it's a scary word, because a lot of
yeah.
people hear boundaries and think pushing away. And the thing about boundaries that I learned about couple years ago, that this phrasing, I love this phrasing. Boundaries are not there to push someone away. They're there to maintain the friendship, the relationship.
I love that.
Yeah, which is so
Yeah,
true, because if I'm going to set a boundary with someone, I'm not trying to push them away. I'm trying to make it so that we can continue this relationship, because right now something is not working. Something has to give, because otherwise I will have to push you away.
yeah,
Just from my own sense of safety, security, peace of mind. And I think that's such an important thing to say, and to know, because yeah, and if I really wanted to push someone away, I wouldn't even set a boundary, because I am not going to go through that if I don't want to be around them, basically.
yeah,
So and that's kind of the misconception here about boundaries in general. And so I think that when you are going about setting a boundary, I think that you need to know within yourself that this is okay, that you're not responsible for someone else's safety within degree. Like, don't do something overtly unsafe. But in this sense,
right.
it's not your responsibility. And another thing I've heard about boundaries is that if you set a boundary and it's not received well, that means that boundary needs to be set. And
Yeah.
it feels sucky. I can validate that 200%. But when you set a boundary and it's received like, well, what did you do? And oh my gosh, I can't believe this. You are evil. Blah blah blah. It can feel really sucky. And you can walk away being like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, but you should have, because that shows that you really need to set that boundary. Because if not, then what else would have happened? And so
exactly.
I guess knowing that if it's not received well, that's not your responsibility. That's not your fault. And even it's kind of it means that it needed to be set and that you did a good job. Knowing that if you do end up ending the relationship, that's okay. Knowing that you're not ending it, you're not pushing them away, you're giving them a chance to continue the relationship. You're giving them a chance. You're letting them know that, hey, this is something that I need from you. This is something that I need from the relationship. And if they can honor that, then we can keep going. And if they can't, then that means that maybe they're not, I think just some people don't mesh, and that's okay. And people, maybe they mesh, years ago, but as they grow, one person kind of develops a little bit more or develops differently than someone else. And if they were a great friend then, great. But if they're not a great friend now, then maybe you need to let them go. And I know it sucks. I know it's not a fun thing to do, but it's something that has to happen.
Beside, obviously, I would say with anybody, struggling with the mother wound or the father wound or the parent wound, obviously therapy is we always recommend like professional help therapy for seeking out the right kind of therapy. But that besides that, are there things that people can do in day-to-day life, whether it's grounding exercises or whatever else, or certain psychological exercises, would you recommend for people who are struggling as a way to supplement the therapy?
So I think that there are multiple ways to go about this. And I think that we're not cookie cutters. And so what helps one person may not help another person, but I do have some tips and tricks. Obviously, again, in addition to therapy. And I will say really quickly about therapy is that not every therapist is going to be a good fit for you, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean that therapy is not a good fit for you. That means that specific provider was not a good fit for you. And I guess the other thing I'll say is that if you are someone who has that parent wound, I would definitely try and find a therapist who knows a little bit about attachment theory, a therapist who is more relational based, who is more strength based, who is more client centered. I think those are really, really important things. And then past that, whatever works for you. So things that you can do in addition to therapy, meditation, grounding, praying, all of those kinds of experiences, like things you can do. Those can all be really helpful to kind of put yourself back in your body and stay in the moment. So those are really helpful. Another thing I would do is I would kind of notice what's happening. I would notice where you find the most distress and kind of figure out why. And that is something you also can talk to your therapist about. So for example, let's say that whenever I get a B on a test, I get super uncomfortable and it's, really anxiety provoking. So then kind of finding out why. Why is that? Because logistically, most people are not that distressed over a B, or maybe let's say even an A minus. Like it sucks for some people, but for other people, they're like, whatever. And so kind of figuring out why that is. Why do you have that idea of maybe perfectionism? Is it because, and what would happen if you didn't? What is the worst thing that could happen? Like, what does it mean to you if you get a B? What does it say about yourself? What does it say about others? What does it say about the world? And that's where you kind of get down to that core belief. And so what I do with my clients is that whenever they have that kind of sense, and I'll say, okay, so what's so bad about that? What's so bad about getting a B? And then they'll say, well, because I didn't get an A. What's so bad about that? Because I should do better. Okay, so what's so bad about not doing better? I'm a failure. There you go. Okay, so you believe, that core belief is that you feel like you are a failure. So let's, work on that. So then what I would do with this client, and even if you are your individual self, is every day, write down all the things that you did that day that were not a failure. You woke up. You got yourself your own breakfast. You went to school. You're even in school. You got a job. You have a stable job for X amount of months. What? And all those things to kind of help you see how much of not a failure you are. So basically kind of trying to counteract that idea. I would also be mindful of your self-talk. How do you talk to yourself? Do you talk to yourself similarly how your parents talk to you? When you did a good job on something, are you proud of yourself? And if you're not, what is that thought that comes into play? And how do you not become proud of yourself? Because most people, they will automatically become proud of themselves unless there's something else there. So let's say, again, for me, let's say I just graduated high school, right? And so automatically I would be really proud, but for some reason I'm not. So that means there's something that was blocking me from that feeling. And so maybe if I really think about it, I can think about, oh, yeah, I said that it's not that big of a deal. That's what it was. So then that's when we change that thought and we start saying, and when we do things, even if it's small things, we say, that was a big deal. That was a huge deal. Like, and you congratulate yourself. So those are kind of, and obviously those two examples were very specific examples, but I guess what I would say is figure out how that parent affected you. Figure out what specifically they did and how that plays out in your current life. Go to therapy. And also find ways to counteract that belief. Find evidence, find proof that goes against what your parents said. And begin to do some like self work, some self love, some self compassion, and understand that what they said is not necessarily true, and what they said is not necessarily about you. And kind of understand that you are a separate person, and do some mourning work, do some grief work, because we talk a lot about grief around, people who are passing away from birth, basically. But that's not what grief is, or that's not all what grief is. Grief is also a loss of a job, a loss of a friendship. It's also a loss of a childhood, and it's also a loss of feeling safe or feeling comfortable or having a better life, especially in a childhood, because again, it impacts you so much. So have some compassion, do some inner child work, acknowledge that it was not your fault that X, Y, and Z happened. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was someone else's baggage. It wasn't yours. And you had carried it for this long. So give yourself permission to put it down. And I'm not saying to forget about it. I'm not saying to, definitely not like we'll just forgive and forget about it or move on. I'm not saying that, but I am saying acknowledge that this is not your baggage to hold. And begin to do that work. I will say it won't be easy, and there'll be times where you'll regress and you'll say, no, but I am a failure. I am a failure. And that's okay, because we all have moments of that. And I think it's important to remember, especially if you do have that perfectionist tendency, if you make a mistake, if you go back, that's okay. And we all do it. We're not perfect. And in some ways, having that regression is almost a good thing, because that means that you're doing the hard work. If you were doing a lot of that superficial work, you may not regress that like that, So the fact that you're really getting in there, it's like, I always use it, example of like going to work out. If you work out every day and you never feel anything, then I don't know if you're really doing anything. If you work out every day.
That's a good example, actually. That's a very good example.
Yeah, and then you work out and then you come home and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sore. You're doing things, something has happened. So I guess those are, kind of some of the things that I would say. And again, it really varies from person to person. If you don't have a social support system, go get one. Obviously not that. However, like that is super, super important. Find things that you're good at, find skills that you're good at, even if how your parents impacted you was not based on failure or achievement, still find things that you're good at. Still find, whether it's painting or drawing or gardening or sports or, whatever, dancing, just find something that you're good at, because that can boost your self-esteem. So I guess counteracting those beliefs, self-care, inner child work, mindfulness, grounding, and finding things that you're good at.
Tell people where they can find you on social media and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have two Instagrams. I have my personal one, and then I have my more professional one, which I don't use very much, to be honest. My personal one, it's going to be mental _health _and_other and then _things. So I do some mental health posts, but I also do things that I'm good at. So that's cooking and gardening and art and that kind of stuff. And then my professional one's actually linked under that, under that profile, I guess. But if you want to know, it's just Cook, so COOKS, psychoeducation. And then if you want to find my Etsy, where I basically I put out prints of mental health things. Some of them are digital, which are around $3. If they're a single digital print, but if they're bundles, they're going to be a little bit more. And then I also do physical ones, which I send to you. And I do sales and discounts and all that kind of stuff. So, and then that one is going to be TheraPrint. So it's THERA, and then print. So PRINTS, by, and then Autumn, AUTUMN. So there's that as well. And you can also find that in, I think, my professional Instagram. So all of them are kind of awkwardly linked with each other, but none of them are linked all together. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Neil, for having me on again.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah. I enjoyed talking, and I hope it was insightful and helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So, all right. Have a good day.
Thank you, too.